So this is my book. This is it. I am Marko Bojcun. The title of my book is Towards a Political Economy of Ukraine, Selected Essays, 1990 to 2015. These essays were written over a 25-year period of time from the moment of Ukraine's independence to the outbreak of the war between Russia and Ukraine in 2014 and onwards. The essays examine the evolution of the political system of Ukraine after independence and of the economy and the relationship between these two aspects, and in particular the impact the evolution of Ukrainian society and the state have had on ordinary people. That is a focal point of my essay. So I look at, on the political side, at the early elections in 94 and 95, the coming of Leonid Kuchma to the presidency. He played a very big part in rebuilding the state institutions in order to centralize power and to carry out market reforms. I then go on to examine how the economy went into a disastrous fall in the 1990s, reducing GDP by more than half, the negative effects that had on the well-being of Ukrainian society, and how the class structure evolved to put in the leadership both of the state and of the economy of the class we call today the oligarchs. So that is really where I begin. And I go on in the book then to examine the relations of the Ukrainian state with Russia to the east and the European Union to the west, the failure of the country and its governing institutions to find a modus vivendi with either the east or the west, and to be therefore left isolated in the international political arena without membership either in the European Union or any kind of association with the military or the political or the economic institutions of the unions that Russia tried to set up on the ruins of the former Soviet Union. I see a parallel between the failure to establish independence after 1648 and the decline that Ukraine has suffered after 1991 in terms of the alliance of its leadership with society at large. And that is one of my big concerns, is that Ukraine has not managed in this period to consolidate and to reinforce a healthy society that will back its national state leadership. Rather, we are going through a time when the economy has fallen and has stayed below the levels of prosperity that Ukrainian society enjoyed in the Soviet period up to the mid-1970s. And we also see a political system from which society at large is alienated. Needless to say, Ukrainians will defend their independence from foreign powers fiercely, but the situation that has emerged since 1991 in the economy and in the political institutions does not bode well for its defense, should it continue to face the kind of threat it now faces from the Russian state. I see change, positive change, coming from the strengthening of Ukrainian society, from the strengthening of independent civic institutions, of the creation of genuine political parties rather than vehicles for the interests of the rich. And if I were to play a role in Ukrainian politics, I would choose to work for the building of a healthy, democratic Ukrainian society with popular institutions such as trade unions and genuine political parties and other kinds of associations that could stand up to the government that we have right now and would impose and communicate and represent the interests of society rather than the interests of the rich. That's my position. Well, it is a big challenge. However, I was trained as a political scientist as a historian. I've studied Ukrainian history and politics for since 1971. What's that? Almost 50 years. I've traveled to Ukraine frequently. I've worked in Ukraine in the public sector there, working with civil servants. I have some experience and acquaintance with people in different levels of society, including people in government. You know, I'm quite happy to speak with them and to learn more about what's going on. So I do feel equipped in a certain way to have an informed view of what's going on in different aspects of Ukrainian society. Economics, I've studied on my own and for myself, but I have a great interest in it, and it constitutes a certain thread, quite a strong thread that runs through this book, because I think the shortcoming of Western academic thought, certainly, and to an extent now in Ukrainian scholarship as well, I see this division between the study of politics and the study of economics. And they really have to go together. They do go together. People have a holistic view of what they want, and they want change across a range of different parts of their lives. And that's why I try to look at it in the round. I try to look at it in a multifaceted way. Well, I think it's partly the result of the specialization of the disciplines, and people are led into their studies increasingly in a more and more narrow framework. And they specialize, and they are employed then to work on fairly small things. Like if you're employed as an architect these days, and you work for a big corporation, you tend to be more than likely sitting in an office behind a computer and designing where the toilets are going to be installed in a multi-story block of flats. That's the way it's gone. It's similar in politics and economics. Also, there is. Well, I'll leave it at that for the moment. I think that's got a lot to do with it in terms of the way in which academics approach it. And in political life, people, if you look at the profile of politicians, they come from a range of backgrounds and former occupations, but they don't tend to carry on their former occupations and professions once they become professional politicians. So I think these are partly the reasons why we have this division between politics and economics. I think that certainly the commentary and analysis of Ukraine and its evolution has much improved since the late 1980s. That has to do with the fact that my generation of Ukrainians had the opportunity to go to university. We took our places in professions, and if we took an interest in what was happening in Ukraine, we had the opportunity then to publish our point of view and our assessments of what was going on in the public media. So people of my generation have contributed to enriching the coverage of Ukraine. I think that has definitely changed. You can see it just by the change that took place over the years in different countries, or the varying changing pace in different countries of journalists switching from the Ukraine to Ukraine. It's a kind of significant change, because it signifies a recognition of Ukraine as a country with a society, not just a physical territory. It's a change from calling it the Argentines to Argentina. Similarly, this is what Ukraine's gone through. So yes, I think there is an improvement in the coverage of Ukraine and a growing diversity. Social media plays a very big role today in what people can learn about what's happening in Ukraine. And here there's a very rich range of media that I can access to learn about developments. Yeah. What I wish I could have done when preparing these essays was to spend more time talking with people in various occupations and various stations of society in Ukraine, and to put their experience of the last 25 years up to 2015, because that's all the book covers, to put their experience into the book in some kind of coherent way. Because my focus has always been what the wide society of Ukraine is going through. Of course, I don't ignore the rich and the powerful, the political elite, the oligarchs. In fact, I devote quite a bit of time to them. But my subject essentially is what are the people of Ukraine going through, and what could possibly be their future. So I would actually have liked to have been able to go more to Ukraine and spend more time visiting different institutions and workplaces educational establishments, and to be able to enrich my book in that way. I've had to rely on newspapers, on the reports of other people. I use a lot of statistics, for example, and I wish I hadn't used so much statistical data. Rather, I'd like to illustrate my findings with the experiences of ordinary people, because I think that's what's essential when one is looking for ways to improve a society and move it to prosperity. Now, I say that because, if I could just make this point, my book documents rather depressingly how Ukrainian economy has shrunk, how the country as a whole has fallen in the world rankings of prosperity and health, levels of education, and other indices of well-being. And that's in the United Nations World Development Index. It's on the Gini Index. Ukraine has fallen from being in the above the world average to below the world average. It's called by some people now the northernmost country of the third world. It's not really among the poorest yet, but that's one of the negative experiences of the period that I cover in this book. The other sad aspect that I could not ignore and studied in considerable detail is how Ukrainian society at large has less opportunity after 25 years of impacting on and affecting the decisions that are made by what we call representative government, by the Verkhovna Rada, and how the institutions of the Ukrainian state have become increasingly centralized around the presidential system, narrowing even more the voice that people could project into the policy process through their elected representatives. We don't have political parties in Ukraine that have large numbers of members. We have political parties which are the vehicles, essentially, of fairly narrow groups of people or very, very narrow groups of oligarchs that pursue their interests. People who want to, there are no prescriptions of a policy kind, as far as I know, for widening the participation of Ukrainian society in the decision-making process. The society has to build its own institutions, its own civic institutions. I think we can appreciate that after decades of Stalinist rule, after the extermination of a whole generation of Ukrainian intelligentsia in the 1930s, after the emasculation of any kind of civic participation in government in the Soviet period, that in 1991, the society came into its independence unequipped and without experience of participating in democratic government. There's a huge lack. In the late 1980s, there were some very promising signs. The independent trade union movement had a significant impact on the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the miners' strike in 1988 that forced the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to give up its constitutional monopoly on power. The size and the influence of the ecological movement after the Chernobyl disaster was very big. There were all kinds of institutions, organizations built from the ground up by the society, and they could have been nurtured and strengthened and given a political face, a political institutional face as parties. That did not happen. And the responsibility for that lies not only on society, but how the elite chose to build a state. Furthermore, the Ukrainian state really did not exist in 1991, except as a territorial administrative unit of the Soviet central government. There was no Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There was no economic strategy. There was no currency. There was no tax system. And all that had to be built. But how it was built is what is critical. And it was built without the wider democratic participation of society or the monitoring by society of how effective and democratic those new institutions actually were to become. So it hasn't been a particularly beneficial process as far as equipping society to act independently and be able to be the watchdog of its own government. However, I think Ukrainian citizens are very politically aware. I think they're quite sophisticated. They've had to navigate very difficult 30 years. The war in eastern Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, the international financial crisis of 2008, which basically destroyed the savings of a small middle class that was growing up. Prior to that, there was a financial crisis in 1997, 98, that destroyed the finances of the Ukrainian government. All that knocked the society around so much that I think one of the consequences was to educate people as to their environment, their context, what they were up against. So I think Ukrainian society is quite politically sophisticated today, but it doesn't have the institutions or the avenues to amalgamate, to group together its grievances in a collective way and to project its demands for change onto its own government effectively enough for that government to respond and pursue the kind of reforms that are necessary. Well, let me say a little bit how I wrote this book, if I may. I don't want to keep you too long, but I'll try to be precise. In 1990, when I wrote the first article that appears in this collection, the situation for Ukraine was quite optimistic as far as I saw it. There were many good signs. And I set out with that optimism. I began working as an academic, and I chose to research the ongoing evolution of Ukrainian society and its now independent state. And I did so over a period of 25 years. And this book is really a snapshot of the domestic and international political and economic and historical situations that Ukraine found itself on 9 occasions, in the 9 separate essays of the book. So really, it's really a chronicle of what happened as I saw it. Now it's history, and I think this book is useful for the reader in 2 ways. One is to read what happened and how it happened over that period of time from my point of view. But the other way that the book can be used is to accept that this is now history and to ask ourselves, well, what is changing now? What is happening now? How does what's happening now compare to how it was in 1990 and in 2000 and 2014? Because that will provide the reader with some measure of comparison to see which way we're going. And so I'm trying to take a rest, but I'm finding it rather difficult because once I get into a pattern of work, although I'm officially retired, I don't make any money anymore from work. Rather, I get enjoyment from it now, so I have good reason to carry on. I've been thinking. I'm slowly writing my memoirs, but they won't come out for many years, if I live that long. But I don't plan to publish them imminently. But I'm also starting to work on a new project about how Ukrainian society can strengthen its own democratic civic institutions. That is something that I'm thinking about right now and trying to approach. And I have to say I have good, very good friends in Ukraine, colleagues, people I communicate with, the people who have actually, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Kyiv sponsored the translation, publication, and now the distribution of my book on the working class in the Ukrainian Revolution. So I have one foot, so to speak, in Kiev and 1 foot in London. So I'm lucky in that way that I can do that. But I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to have an interview with you, William, and to join the pantheon of other scholars that you have interviewed and made available through YouTube, which I think is a very valuable resource, and I'm happy to join it. Thank you.